You're out of time. The words snapped through the air like a whip crack, sharp and final. Valen Dros slammed the final support beam into place, his movements a blur of muscle and intent. Sparks erupted from the welding arc in his hands, casting jagged shadows across the bunker's reinforced plating. The air reeked of molten alloy, a scent that clung to the skin, thick and metallic. His gloves sizzled where stray embers kissed the fabric, but he didn't flinch. Above him, the sky churned in a grotesque display of planetary warfare. Pharos 9's upper atmosphere twisted in unnatural colors, a consequence of orbital debris burning through gravity rifts. Streaks of vaporized warships cut through the sky like arteries spilling their contents into the void. Behind him, the towering figure of High Strategist Orvix Tan folded his four elongated arms, his skin shifting from deep obsidian to an irritated shade of copper green. The professor's quartz-like pupils contracted sharply, the alien equivalent of a sneer. This challenge was meant to test problem-solving under extreme duress, not to indulge in reckless shortcuts, Orvix Tan said, his dual-larynx speech layered with artificial disapproval. You've insulted the integrity of this exercise, Dros. The others are still constructing. Valen wiped sweat from his brow, his breath still measured, his heart hammering with the satisfaction of completion. He flicked a glance at the nearest heads-up display, which showed the elapsed time. 10 minutes. A hush fell over the cadets. The weight of disbelief settled over the war front like a pending detonation. Valen wasn't interested in their gawking. He stepped back, assessing the bunker with a craftsman's eye. The structure wasn't elegant. It was purposeful, tough, ugly, and infallible. A fortress made to defy annihilation, not to impress a council. Unlike the others, he hadn't relied on the Academy's matter replication technology or the quantum alloy processors embedded in the training site. Instead, he dug into the planet itself, reinforced it with foundational triangulation, and layered the plating with material designed to disperse kinetic energy instead of resisting it outright. It was the kind of knowledge that couldn't be downloaded into neural implants or extracted from centuries of alien engineering principles. It was the kind of knowledge that bled through generations of warfighters, passed from calloused hand to calloused hand. And it was the kind of knowledge that had just made a fool of the greatest war academy in the known universe. A throat-clearing rasp cut through the silence. Impossible. The disbelief came from a cadet 2 rows back, a Taharva strategist, her carapace clicking faintly as her mandibles twitched in agitation. Others murmured their agreement, some scoffing outright. The challenge had been issued to test engineering under fire, an hour to construct a shelter capable of withstanding direct bombardment. Yet here stood a human, one of the last remnants of a near-extinct Terran war battalion, finishing in a fraction of the time. Orvix Tan's expression shifted through several tones of dissatisfaction. His top left hand gestured toward the laser plasma display now flashing red. You think this crude heap can survive the real test? Valen shrugged. You tell me. With a gesture, Orvix Tan activated the live combat protocol. The ground vibrated. A distant detonation rattled through the earth like the first crack in an overburdened dam. Overhead, the protective atmospheric shields flickered, momentarily revealing the truth of the battlefield above. War was already here. Pharos 9 wasn't just a training ground. It was an unofficial battlefield, one that existed beneath the scrutiny of intergalactic law. The students, no, soldiers in training, weren't just here to learn. They were here to be tested for something much, much bigger. And no one had told them. The first wave of bombardment struck the outskirts of the cadet encampment, sending gouts of superheated earth into the air. The metallic tang of ionized soil burned in the nostrils. Across the landscape, the other cadets scrambled to reinforce their half-finished structures. Some of their shelters collapsed outright, too dependent on self-sustaining architecture that failed without active power feeds. Valen's shelter? It stood firm. Orvix Tan's gaze darkened as another blast wave tore through the base camp, flattening everything except the human-built structure in the center of the chaos. What? The second wave hit before he could finish. Antimatter concussions rippled through the encampment, bending reality at the seams. Half the structures imploded from stress fractures in their synthetic materials. But Valen's bunker absorbed the force, distributing the impact through its reinforced lattice. The pressure fed into the earth itself, displacing the energy instead of fighting it head-on, exactly as he had planned. Orvik's tan turned back to him, a new expression settling over his features, one of careful, calculating interest. "How did you—" A piercing shriek, the kind that didn't belong to any known species in the cadet program, split through the thick, smoke-choked air. It wasn't part of the exercise. Something was coming. The cadets who had survived the bombardment emerged from the wreckage, their faces bloodied, their expressions shifting from confusion to sheer, naked fear. A Tarva female collapsed beside Valen's bunker, her multifaceted eyes wide and glistening, gasping out something in her native tongue before she went still. A shadow passed overhead, far too fast, far too deliberate. Not an Academy drone, not a simulated war zone construct. Real. Orvik's tan exhaled sharply, his posture shifting in a way that finally betrayed something Valen had never seen in the professor before. Fear. "Activate planetary defenses." The command was already too late. Valen turned his gaze toward the burning sky, his instincts already calculating. The battle wasn't coming. It was already here. The sky was dying. Pharos 9's upper atmosphere had fractured into a kaleidoscope of unnatural distortions, the air splitting apart in jagged, flickering seams. Warships burned in streaks of molten wreckage, their destruction painting the heavens in streaks of fire and ruptured metal. The war hadn't arrived. It had already taken root. Valen Dross took stock of the battlefield before the chaos had a chance to settle into his bones. The bodies of cadets lay scattered, their training gear offering little protection against the unseen force that had cut them down mid-flight. The ground itself trembled as several somethings, tore through the lower atmosphere, carving through layers of defensive shielding like they were gossamer threads in a storm. Orvik's tan's voice was measured but taut, layered with a kind of dread Valen had never heard from the alien strategist before. "Activate planetary defenses," he commanded again, but this time the order felt smaller, like he already knew it was too late. Valen didn't wait to see if the Academy's automated turrets would wake up in time. He moved. The difference between training and war had always been reaction time. He had learned that lesson long before the Terran battalions had been reduced to memory. His bunker still stood, untouched, while the world around it was ripped apart like brittle parchment. Not because it was superior. Not because it was engineered with some new breakthrough. It survived because it wasn't fighting back. A crash split the air sharp enough to fracture eardrums. The bunker groaned under the force of a pressure wave so sudden it sucked the air out of Valen's lungs. He turned to see a towering form descending from the sky, a silhouette wreathed in burning debris and raw distortion. It wasn't a warship. It was something alive. The DRS Dominion had found them. Valen had read the reports. Encounters were rare, survivors even rarer. The DRS weren't conquerors in the traditional sense. They didn't invade planets. They erased them. Orvik's tan's normally composed features flickered through a spectrum of agitation, his quartz-like eyes narrowing to needle-thin slits. "Fall back!" he snapped at the remaining cadets, but no one moved. They were frozen, caught in the gravitational pull of something their minds had yet to comprehend. Valen grabbed the nearest body, a cadet whose breathing was erratic. Her exoskeletal armor cracked along the shoulder. "Move!" he barked, dragging her toward the bunker's entrance. "Unless you want to be part of whatever comes next." That seemed to snap the others out of their paralysis. They bolted. The bunker doors sealed shut behind them with a hiss of hydraulic clamps locking into place. The sudden quiet inside was almost worse than the carnage outside. No one spoke. The air felt too thick, saturated with something more than just the tension of battle. Valen paced to the nearest heads-up display embedded in the bunker wall, its laser plasma projection flickering as it attempted to process the external environment. The readouts were erratic, struggling to measure an enemy that shouldn't have been here. Orvik's tan stood beside him, his elongated fingers twitching against his belt in thought. "This isn't an accident," the strategist murmured. This planet is off every known star chart. There are 7 layers of classified security protocols surrounding its location. The Dralks did not stumble upon us. Valen frowned. There was a quiet accusation buried in those words. Are you suggesting someone told them where to look? Orvik's Tan didn't answer immediately. His expression remained unreadable, but his posture had shifted ever so slightly towards suspicion. Before the silence could stretch too long, the bunker shook. The walls groaned against the impact, dust shaking loose from the reinforced beams. A sound crawled through the structure, not a natural tremor, but something far more deliberate, more measured. Valen turned back to the heads-up display. The outside feed flickered, then cut to a new visual, one that made his blood run cold. A Dralek soldier stood mere meters from the bunker entrance. It wasn't like the recordings, the grainy, distorted footage retrieved from black site engagements. This was clear. The Dralek's warrior was taller than any humanoid species in the Academy, its exoskeletal frame pulsing with something almost fluid, like it was constantly shifting between solid and incorporeal states. Its 4-pronged maw twitched as if tasting the air, and where its eyes should have been, there were only empty voids, shifting with colorless turbulence. Then it raised one clawed appendage and pressed it against the outer wall of the bunker. Valen's stomach twisted. The wall began to bend. Not crack, not break. Bend. The reinforced alloy warped as if reality itself had been softened, like the laws of physics no longer applied in its presence. One of the cadets, a Zelvarian, her tri-lobed eyes wide with unfiltered panic, backed away, shaking her head. That shouldn't be possible, she whispered. There's no known weapon that can alter... The wall snapped back into place. The Dralks hadn't broken through. It had tested them. Valen exhaled slowly. It knows we're inside, he said, and it isn't in a hurry. That was worse than an immediate attack. Orvik's Tan studied the heads-up display. His normally refined composure darkened with something Valen could only describe as recognition. You've seen this before, Valen muttered. Haven't you? Orvik's Tan's fingers flexed, the barest flicker of hesitation betraying him. If I say yes, would you believe me when I tell you that none of us should be alive right now? Valen let that sink in. Outside, the Dralek's warrior tilted its head as if listening to something unheard. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned away and walked back into the storm of burning wreckage, not retreating, waiting. A beat passed before the next sound rattled through the bunker. A signal ping, not from their communication systems, not from any of the Academy's external feeds. It was coming from inside the bunker. Valen's spine locked into place. There was only one possibility. Someone among them had already called the enemy inside. A low vibration crawled up Valen's spine, the kind that wasn't just felt, but understood. Not a warning, not a threat, an invitation. The signal ping still echoed through the bunker's interior, a steady pulse threading into the walls like a buried heartbeat. Someone inside had called the enemy, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Valen's gaze cut across the cadets, faces carved in tension, bodies wound tight with fear. They all looked equally lost, equally shaken. None of them seemed like traitors. But one of them was. Orvik's Tan's expression had closed off, his 4 arms clasped behind his back in rigid calculation. His gaze flicked to the heads-up display, where the Dralek's warrior still lingered outside, just beyond the bunker's defensive perimeter, waiting. "This signal," Valen murmured, voice low, controlled. "Where is it transmitting from?" The strategist hesitated. Then, with a flick of his fingers, the heads-up display adjusted, pinpointing the origin of the broadcast. Valen's stomach coiled. It wasn't coming from one of the cadets. It was coming from inside the walls. A metallic clatter rang out from the back of the bunker, sharp, deliberate. Every weapon in the room lifted in unison. Valen moved first, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He vaulted over the supplies stacked along the far wall, landing hard near the bunker's reinforced foundation. Then he saw it, a sliver of metal, no larger than a coin, embedded in the structure like a parasite. It pulsed with energy, threads of silver light rippling outward. A transmitter, buried deep. Valen's breath cooled in his throat. This hadn't been placed just now. This had been here before the bunker was even built. He turned sharply, eyes locking onto Orvik's tan. This thing didn't just appear. It was waiting for activation, which means... The strategist's expression tightened. The Dralks knew about this site long before today. A cold, terrible realization sank into the room. The cadets weren't the targets. The entire academy was compromised. The walls shuddered violently. The Dralks warrior outside had finally moved, not in retreat, in response. Something struck the bunker with a force that bent the air itself, not an explosion, a distortion. Valen barely had time to register the shift before reality itself buckled inward. The walls curved like liquid, the space between atoms stretching, folding, then snapping back into place with an ear-splitting crack. Somewhere behind him, a cadet let out a strangled gasp. Valen twisted, his vision blurring at the edges as the world corrected itself. The air was thick with something electric, something wrong. His thoughts moved sluggishly, like they had to swim through an unseen current. The Dralks weren't breaking through the bunker. They were rewriting it. Orvik's Tan's voice cut through the haze, sharp and unwavering. This is cognitive warfare. Valen blinked hard, forcing clarity. They're not attacking. They're changing something. The strategist nodded grimly. We've seen this before. No survivors. That landed like a hammer between Valen's ribs. No survivors. Not because they were killed, because they were erased. He shook his head, swallowing the thought down. Not happening. Not today. Orvik's Tan met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in those deep-set quartz pupils. Then, with a sharp pivot, he addressed the remaining cadets. We are under a different kind of siege. This is not about firepower. It is about control. If they shift our reality to align with their own, we cease to exist as we are. One of the cadets, a Zelvarian with an intricate array of sensory nodes lining her jaw, exhaled sharply, her voice tight. How do we fight something we can't see? Valen turned back to the transmitter embedded in the bunker's frame. We cut off their reach. He pulled a combat knife from his belt and drove the blade straight into the pulsing core of the device. The effect was immediate. The bunker lurched violently, as if reality itself had snapped back into focus. The metallic distortion collapsed in on itself, sealing the rift before it could expand further. Outside, the Drax warrior's head snapped toward the bunker, its form flickering in and out of existence like a shattered reflection. It knew. The cadets braced, weapons raised, bodies coiled in expectation of the next assault. But the Dralks did not charge. Instead, it turned and vanished into the storm beyond the wreckage. Not retreating. Gathering something worse. Valen exhaled, jaw tight. They were testing their hold on this place. Now they know we can fight it. Orvik's Tan gave a slow nod, which means they will escalate. The strategist turned toward the laser plasma display, fingers sweeping across the interface with practiced urgency. I need access to the Academy's planetary network. If we are compromised, I need to know how deep it goes. Valen glanced toward the cadets, their postures tense but waiting. They weren't soldiers, not yet. But today they would either become warriors, or they would die. He turned back to Orvik's Tan. Tell me the worst-case scenario. The strategist's gaze didn't waver. They have rewritten entire civilizations before, he said simply. Not through war, not through invasion. Valen's pulse slowed. Then how? Orvik's Tan's expression darkened. They erase the past. They make sure no one remembers what was lost. Valen felt the weight of those words settle deep into his bones. Outside, the storm raged on. The sky fractured as something massive descended from the upper atmosphere, its silhouette too large, too unnatural to be a warship. It blocked out the sun, casting the battlefield into shadow, and somewhere in the distance, the Draleks waited. For the next move, the sky shattered, not from an explosion, not from weapons fire. It ruptured like a torn veil, reality peeling away in jagged, writhing fractures. From the wound above, something descended, something that didn't belong to the laws of nature. It wasn't a ship. Ships had form, had symmetry, had logic in their construction. This thing moved in ways that defied the mind's ability to categorize it. The longer Valen stared, the more his senses rejected what they were perceiving. It twisted and unfolded simultaneously, its surface shifting like oil spreading across water but never settling. The bunker's walls vibrated, not from sound, but from the sheer weight of its presence. Behind him, the cadets were frozen, weapons clutched so tightly their fingers had turned bloodless. Orvik's Tan stood rigid, his posture betraying something close to recognition. Valen forced his voice through the pressure that had thickened the air. "What the hell am I looking at?" Orvik's Tan's fingers twitched. "A concept given form. Not a being, not a machine, a reality parasite." A cold knot twisted deep in Valen's gut. "That's not an answer." The strategist's jaw tensed. The Dralks do not wage war with weapons alone. They rewrite the enemy before the first battle is ever fought. This is how they begin. Outside, the air rippled like disturbed water, space bending in ways it shouldn't. The cadet closest to the heads-up display stumbled back, eyes wide. "That's not real," she whispered. Valen clenched his jaw. "It's real enough to kill us." The Draleks did not rush their conquests. They had no need for shock and awe invasions, no fleets swarming like locusts. They dismantled worlds with slow, creeping certainty, altering history until resistance was never conceived in the first place. Valen had seen annihilation before, burning cities, lost wars. But this was different. This was the kind of enemy that didn't leave scars. It erased the very concept of loss. Something shifted outside. The air split apart again, and from the space between spaces, figures began to emerge. The Draux warriors did not walk. They flowed, their exoskeletal bodies melting through the fractures in reality like liquid metal taking shape. Their forms were not fixed, their limbs stretched too long, then snapped back, their movements defying inertia. And then the voices began. Not audible voices, not speech, thoughts slipping into their minds like whispers that had always been there. Valen's breath stalled. They weren't speaking. They were remembering. Except the memories weren't theirs. A battle that never happened. A war that was already lost. His grip tightened around his rifle. Number Orvik's Tan's voice was ice. "Do not engage. If they enter your thoughts, they will rewrite you from within." Valen ground his teeth. "You're saying we don't fight back? You fight wrong, you lose yourself. That is how they win." He turned sharply. "Then how do we fight right?" The strategist did not answer. The first Draux warrior crossed the perimeter. The bunker lights flickered, dimming for half a second, and when they returned, one of the cadets was missing. No body, no sound, just gone. Valen's breath sharpened. He turned, scanning the faces of the remaining survivors. No one reacted, because they didn't realize anyone was missing. Cold realignment snapped through his skull. The Draux weren't just killing them. They were removing them from existence, erasing the memory of them as if they had never stood there at all. Valen shoved past Orvik's Tan, voice like steel. "Everyone, listen to me." The cadets jerked toward him, their expressions unfocused, some blinking as though waking from a deep fog. "You will feel something missing, something that you cannot name. That is the sign you are losing. You hold on to that absence. You fight for it. If we forget, we are dead." A shiver passed through the group. They felt it now, the phantom weight of something wrong, something unnamed but undeniably real. Orvik's Tan's gaze was unreadable. "That might buy us minutes." Valen's fingers flexed over his weapon. Minutes are how wars are won. A soundless rupture split through the air, and another cadet disappeared. Valen caught it this time, the flicker of hesitation, the instant where she was still standing there, then wasn't. He moved before he could think, before the moment could settle into the memory of her never existing. His fist slammed against the metal frame of the bunker, the sharp impact cutting through the distortion. The remaining cadets flinched. Then their gazes snapped toward the empty space where the missing girl should have been. And then she was back. Her body reappeared in the same spot, her face twisted in horror, A soundless scream locked in her throat. She collapsed, gasping for breath. Valen caught her before she hit the ground. The cadets stared in horror. They had all seen her vanish, and now she was standing there as if she had never been gone. Valen turned to Orvikstan. "They only win if we forget." The strategist's expression darkened. "That will not be enough." Outside, the Dralk's figures had stopped, watching, waiting, as if they hadn't expected resistance. Valen exhaled sharply, setting the cadet against the bunker wall. "Then tell me what is." Orvikstan hesitated. "You are thinking of this in the wrong terms. They are not enemies to be fought. They are parasites that must be starved." Valen's jaw tightened. "And how do you starve something that feeds on existence?" The strategist's eyes flicked toward the heads-up display, the laser plasma projection flickering erratically. "You give them nothing to consume." Valen stared at him. "That makes no—" Then he understood. His stomach dropped. "You're suggesting—" "You must cease to be real to them," Orvikstan said. "If you can make them forget you, they will lose their grasp on this reality." A silence spread through the room, heavier than any battlefield charge. Valen's pulse thundered behind his ribs. Outside, the Dralks had begun to move again. He had minutes, maybe seconds. "That's insane," one of the cadets said. "You're asking us to—" "I'm not asking," Valen snapped. "I'm telling you how we survive." His gaze locked onto Orvikstan. "I need to know exactly how to make them forget we exist." The strategist's expression was carved from stone. "You are not going to like the answer." The bunker shook again, and this time it did not stop. The bunker convulsed like a living thing. Steel groaned under the pressure of something that wasn't force, wasn't physics, something deeper, older, rewriting the rules that held the walls together. The lights flickered, but the shadows didn't move right. They stretched too long, bent in places where no source of light should have reached. Valen felt it first, the slow, creeping unraveling at the edges of his mind. A pressure against his thoughts, a hand reaching where it had no right to be, not pulling, not erasing, adjusting. He clenched his jaw, forcing his mind to anchor itself in the present. He would not let them reshape him. Orvikstan's voice cut through the tension, calm, but weighted. "We have minutes before their reality overtakes our own." "Then tell me what I need to do." The strategist hesitated, and for the first time something flickered across his face that might have been doubt. "You're not ready to hear it." Valen stepped closer, his breath slow and deliberate. "I don't need to be ready. I need to know." The bunker shuddered again, but this time it wasn't from an external attack. The space inside the room stretched, contracted, then reset, like reality was trying to correct something that didn't fit. The Dralks were forcing their way in, not through the walls, but through existence itself. Orvikstan exhaled through gritted teeth. "They are feeding on the concept of us. They erase by rewriting perception, by bending the fabric of what is remembered and what is forgotten. But if we sever the connection, if we make them forget us first, then we stop existing to them," Valen finished. Orvikstan nodded grimly. "Exactly." A cold weight settled in Valen's chest. He turned to the cadets, who were listening but barely holding on. Their faces were pale, some blinking in confusion, as if they were already losing pieces of themselves. "We have to move now," he said, "before we become ghosts." The Dralks didn't need to fight. They just needed time. Valen grabbed the nearest rifle and slung it over his shoulder. "How do we sever the link?" The strategist's expression darkened. "By removing all traces of our presence from this battlefield." Valen's grip tightened. "You mean—" "Not just us," Orvikstan interrupted. "Everything we've touched. The bunker, the weapons, the memory of this fight. If even a trace of us remains, they can use it to pull us back into their control." Valen's pulse thundered. "You want to erase our own history." The strategist nodded. "If we don't, they will do it for us." Valen glanced at the cadets. "And what happens if we succeed?" Orvikstan's gaze was sharp, unwavering. Then to the Dralks, we will have never existed. The air inside the bunker grew colder. The walls were losing their solidity, the floor shifting like a mirage in the heat. They were running out of time. Valen turned sharply. "Everyone, strip this place down. Nothing stays. No signatures, no traces of our technology, no evidence we were ever here." The cadets hesitated, but only for a moment. They tore into their surroundings with an almost feral urgency, ripping apart equipment, smashing anything that could leave a residual imprint. The bunker groaned again, the reality around them stretching thinner. And then, a sound. Not a voice, not a weapon, a memory that wasn't theirs. Valen staggered, his vision narrowing. He was somewhere else. The walls were gone. A field of burning cities stretched in every direction. Number not burning. They had never been built. A hand touched his shoulder, but when he turned, there was no one there. His mind wrenched back to the present. Orvix Tan was watching him, expression unreadable. "They're pushing harder. You need to hold on." Valen exhaled through gritted teeth. "Then let's finish this." The bunker shook violently, the Drogs pressing forward, forcing the final rewrite. They had seconds left. Orvix Tan moved to the control panel, fingers flicking across the laser plasma interface, deconstructing every recorded trace of their presence. One by one, the digital records vanished. The battle reports dissolved. The Academy's logs rewrote themselves. Valen felt it happening. A pulling sensation. Not physical, conceptual, like the threads of his own existence were slipping between his fingers. One of the cadets collapsed mid-step, her body flickering, as if reality itself wasn't sure if she had ever stood there at all. Valen grabbed her arm, anchoring her to something real. "Stay with me." She blinked at him, unfocused, her own name lost on her lips. Valen turned to Orvix Tan. "Tell me we're almost there." The strategist's fingers stilled. Then a final keystroke. The lights cut out. The world collapsed inward. For a moment, there was nothing. No pain. No sound. No sense of self. Just an absence so complete it could not be named. Then, Valen breathed. His eyes opened. The bunker was gone. The battlefield was empty. No burning wreckage. No bodies. No trace of war. The Drogs were gone. But as Valen turned, he realized, so was Orvix Tan. And so were the cadets. His hands trembled as he reached for his communicator. No signal, no records, no proof they had ever fought here. The Drogs had not erased them. They had erased themselves. Valen stood in the silence of a war that had never happened, and he alone remembered. Nothing. Silence pressed against Valen like a weighted shroud, not the kind that followed battle, thick with the stink of charred metal and sweat-soaked desperation. This was different. This was the silence of something that had never happened. He turned in slow, deliberate movements, his boots leaving no mark on the ground. There was no battlefield, no wreckage, no evidence of the war that had raged only moments ago. It was as if the planet itself had forgotten. The bunker had vanished. So had the cadets. So had Orvix Tan. His breath dragged rough against his throat. He reached for his communicator, though he already knew what he'd find. Nothing. No signal, no static, not even an error message. As if the device had been plucked out of existence but left in his hand to mock him. A single thought pressed against his mind. Unwelcome and impossible. Was I even here? He forced himself to focus. Memory, real memory, was an anchor. The Daleks had tried to erase him, tried to twist reality to swallow him whole, but something had gone wrong. He was still standing, still breathing, still remembering. That meant something. Valen exhaled sharply and knelt, pressing his fingers into the dirt, cold, dry, real. He dug his nails into it, forcing sensation into his nerves. They hadn't erased the planet, just everything that happened on it. But why leave him behind? He pushed up, scanning the horizon. No ships, no movement, no sky wound where the Daleks had descended. The air was still, too still, like the planet was holding its breath. Then, a flicker. At first it was nothing more than a trick of light, the kind the mind dismissed when overwhelmed with exhaustion. But then it happened again, deeper in the distance. A distortion, as if the fabric of reality had been stretched too thin and something beneath it was pressing to break free. He moved, not running, hunting. The landscape twisted in shades of burnt orange and slate, the rock formations jagged and uneven. Pharos 9 had never been a welcoming planet, but now it felt even less so, empty in a way that had nothing to do with population. Valen reached a ridge and crouched low, muscles tensed for an ambush that never came. Below, at the center of a dry basin, the air shimmered. Not heat waves, not light distortion, something trying to hold its shape. He drew his weapon but kept his finger off the trigger. If the Dralks were still here, they wouldn't attack conventionally. They would unmake him before he had the chance to resist. He scanned the area. Then he saw it, a handprint in the dust, fresh. His stomach knotted. If the Dralks had taken everything, erased everything, then this meant something survived, or someone. He shifted, stepping into the basin with slow, deliberate movements. The closer he got, the more the distortion pressed against his senses. It wasn't visible, not entirely, but it was felt. A pressure against the mind, a whisper at the edges of thought. Then, in an instant, the distortion collapsed inward, and Valen wasn't alone anymore. A figure blinked into existence, not materializing, not teleporting, returning. Orvix Tan staggered forward, hands bracing against his knees as if reality had slammed into him at full force. His breath came in ragged pulls, his normally composed demeanor fractured under the weight of something heavy, something unseen. Valen aimed his rifle before reason caught up to instinct. "You're supposed to be gone!" Orvix Tan's head snapped up, his quartz-colored eyes locking onto him. He looked like a man who had just walked out of a nightmare, still half convinced he wasn't awake. "So are you," the strategist said. That wasn't an answer. Valen didn't lower his weapon. "Where did you go?" Orvix Tan straightened, dusting off his uniform with slow, methodical movements. "Nowhere." He paused, tilting his head. "And everywhere." Valen's grip tightened. "Try again." The strategist's expression flickered through something unreadable. Then he exhaled. "We were erased, completely. No memory, no trace, no record in any timeline, and yet—" He spread his hands, indicating the empty basin. "We are standing here." Valen lowered his weapon, but not fully. "How?" A slow, thin smile pulled at the corners of Orvix Tan's mouth. "Because something is wrong with the Dralks." Valen narrowed his eyes. "Explain." "Their method is flawless," Orvix Tan said. "They consume the past, unravel existence before it can fight back. No one resists. No one returns." He took a step closer, his expression darkening. "But we did." Valen frowned. "You think they made a mistake?" Orvix Tan shook his head. I think they are failing." The weight of that statement settled between them, heavy with implications neither of them fully understood. Valen ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "If they're failing, it means something is resisting them. Something we don't know about." "Something they don't know about," Orvix Tan corrected. "Which means we have an advantage they don't expect." That sent a slow pulse of adrenaline through Valen's blood. An enemy like the Dralks didn't fail. They didn't lose, which meant something bigger was happening. "How many do you think survived?" he asked. Orvix Tan's expression turned unreadable again. "Unknown." A long silence stretched between them. Then, a flicker at the edge of the basin. Not a distortion, not a memory shift. Movement. Valen reacted first, rifle snapping up. Orvix Tan was half a second behind him, his own stance shifting. And then, cadets emerged from nothing, one by one like shadows peeling away from the ground. Valen's pulse kicked hard. He knew those faces. The Dralks had erased them. And yet, they were here, alive, confused, and most importantly, remembering. Valen took a slow step forward, his throat dry. One of the cadets, a Zelvarian with blackened armor and wide, unfocused eyes, lifted a shaking hand. Her voice cracked, as if the words had been stolen from her lungs before she could finish. I remember being gone." Valen exhaled sharply. The Dralks weren't just failing, they were losing control. And for the first time, he saw what that meant. Not just survival, not just resistance, a war that the Dralks didn't know how to fight. Valen turned to Orvikstan, a slow grin breaking through the tension. We just became their problem, and this time, they would be the ones rewriting history. Valen turned his gaze toward the cadets, their faces lined with exhaustion but their eyes alive with something sharp, something defiant. They had been erased, yet here they stood. That meant something. That meant everything. Orvikstan paced the perimeter of the basin, his movements measured but tight. His mind was already at work, sifting through the implications. The Dralks had failed to remove them. That was a flaw. And if the enemy had flaws, then they could be broken. One of the cadets, a Zelvarian with darkened plates still bearing the residue of reality fractures, swallowed hard. They won't stop coming. Even if they're losing control, they have never lost before. Valen exhaled, steadying his thoughts. Then we give them something they've never had to deal with, a war that doesn't play by their rules. Orvikstan stopped, folding his arms. You're thinking tactically. But this isn't tactics. This is fundamental perception warfare. Their power is rewriting existence. The way we think, the way we remember, everything we plan must account for that. Valen knelt, dragging a line through the dirt with his finger. They've already rewritten this battlefield. If they had succeeded, we wouldn't be here. That means we exist in a space outside their full control. A blind spot. Orvikstan's gaze narrowed. Go on. Valen gestured toward the cadets. Each of us survived in fragments. The Dralks lost their grip on us for a reason. Either they overextended their reach, or their process has limits. We need to figure out what that limit is, and how to widen it. One of the cadets, a lean-bodied Avexi with razor-thin wings folded against his back, stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen war but never expected to fight this kind. We need to understand how they rewrite. If we can predict what they target first, we can disrupt the process. Orvikstan gave a slow nod. Their method isn't random. They remove anchors first, things that hold significance to reality, locations, records, command structures. If those are erased, everything attached to them weakens and collapses. Valen's jaw tightened. Which means we need to create something they can't erase. The cadets exchanged wary glances. That's impossible, one of them murmured. They erase everything. Valen shook his head. Not everything, not us. Something in us resisted. We need to make that resistance contagious. Orvikstan's expression darkened. You're talking about a counterinfection. Valen met his gaze. Yes. The strategist's fingers flexed. How? Valen exhaled. They rewrite from the top down. Erase command, erase history, then erase individuals. We reverse it. We force memory to spread before they can delete it. Orvikstan's eyes flickered with realization. A viral memory, a construct so deeply embedded in those who experience it that removing it becomes impossible. Valen nodded. Exactly. The cadets were listening now, a pulse of something unspoken moving between them. One of them, a heavy-set Koran with plated skin that bore the cracks of reality stress fractures, spoke cautiously. That would require a fixed point, something that no mind can override. Valen gestured toward his own temple. Memory is fallible, but experience? Experience burns into the body in ways no rewrite can touch. Orvikstan's voice was thoughtful. We need to create an event that is so deeply felt, so visceral, that even if the details are erased, the body remembers the feeling. Valen's stomach coiled. And there's only one kind of memory that stays no matter what. Silence. Then the Zelvarian cadet whispered it first. Pain. The word settled over them like an unspoken oath. Orvikstan's expression was unreadable. You're suggesting we create a battlefield that can't be erased because it is felt too deeply? Valen nodded. If enough people experience something simultaneously, the rewrite process fails. It would be like trying to erase a burning city while every survivor still feels the heat on their skin. The Quran cadet exhaled sharply. You're proposing we burn ourselves into reality so deeply that the Dralks can't undo it. Yes, Valen said, and we make them experience it too. The strategist's head tilted. You want to infect the Dralks with memory? Valen's lips curled into something sharp. If they live by rewriting, we make them choke on something they can't erase. A ripple of energy passed through the group. This wasn't strategy. This was war in its rawest form. The Avexi cadet tilted his head. How do we implement it? Valen turned to Orvixtan. We need a battlefield, one they can't pull themselves out of. The strategist was already thinking, his fingers tapping against his arm. We have to bring them here, but we also have to force them into our reality rather than allowing them to rewrite it first. Valen's mind moved fast. We bait them, make them think we're vulnerable, draw them into a contained space. Then we anchor ourselves in the experience so deeply that it burns into them, too. Orvixtan's eyes gleamed. A paradox trap. The Quran cadet frowned. Explain. Orvixtan spoke with the careful deliberation of someone assembling something fragile but devastating. If they experience a memory too deeply, it ceases to be external. It becomes part of them. They would be rewriting themselves. Valen exhaled. Which means they can't erase it without unraveling their own existence. Orvixtan gave a slow nod. A battle so brutal, so deeply ingrained into those who fight it, that even the Dralks can't escape it. The Zelvarian cadet's mandibles clicked. But how do we survive it? Valen flexed his fingers, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. We don't let go. No matter what happens, we hold on to the pain, the memory. We become something permanent. The Avexi cadet exhaled. And if it works? Orvixtan's voice was quiet but unshaken. Then we rewrite them instead. Silence settled like the calm before a detonation. Valen scanned the faces around him. They weren't soldiers. Not yet. But they would be. And this war wouldn't be fought with ships or weapons. It would be fought inside the fabric of reality itself. They weren't just going to win. They were going to burn the Dralks into existence so deeply that they could never escape it. And then, for the first time in history, the Dralks would know what it meant to remember. Valen stood at the center of the battlefield they had carved into the fabric of existence, breath steady despite the chaos unraveling around him. The Dralk had taken worlds, rewritten history, swallowed entire civilizations without so much as a war cry. But not this time. Orvixtan moved beside him, his usually sharp composure weathered but unyielding. His voice carried through the storm, low and deliberate. They're trying to pull back, to escape what we've done. Valen's jaw locked. They can't. And they wouldn't. Not after this. The cadets had done their part, not just fought, but anchored themselves into existence so deeply that no erasure could wash them away. The battlefield had become a wound that the Dralks couldn't close, a memory that couldn't be undone. A scream split the air, not sound, not language, but a concept breaking apart. The Dralks had never been hunted before, never been trapped inside their own tactics. But now, they were drowning in the very thing they had used to conquer. Valen could feel it, the weight of their presence cracking, thinning as their own minds turned against them. One of the cadets, a Zelvarian, wiped blood from her face, staring up at the writhing sky. Her breath hitched. It's working. The Dralks were remembering. Valen took a step forward, fingers flexing at his sides. The ground beneath his boots felt solid, real. It hadn't been a second ago. The first sign of true victory. You feel that, he murmured. Orvixtan did. His pupils, normally sharp, dilated slightly. They're losing their hold. Valen nodded. That's because they're seeing what we see. The Dralks had never experienced loss, never felt the permanence of defeat. Their entire existence was built on the belief that history was a malleable thing, a sequence that could be restructured at will. But now, they were in it. Now they were inside a war that couldn't be erased. A shape convulsed in the sky, one of the larger Dralix entities, its form struggling to maintain structure. It twisted, shifted, as though caught between states of being. It wasn't vanishing, it was being forced to remain. Valen exhaled, the cold press of adrenaline finally ebbing. They're trapped. Orvikstan's gaze didn't leave the battlefield. We just changed them. The strategist rarely let emotion into his voice, but this time there was something raw beneath his words. Valen knew why. The Dralix would never be the same again. They had been rewritten, not by force, but by something far worse. By memory, by consequence. No longer invincible, no longer an unseen force devouring history without cost. Now, they would remember, and they would fear. One of the Dralix, a smaller entity barely holding its form, lurched toward them, its movements uncoordinated, shaking. Not an attack. A plea. Valen stared at it. This was new. The Dralix had never begged before. His voice was steady when he spoke. You feel that, don't you? The entity twitched violently, its body flickering, trying to shift, but failing. Valen stepped closer. You finally understand what it means to exist. The Dralix made no sound, but the air vibrated, rippling with something that had never been there before. Not dominance. Recognition. Orvikstan tilted his head. They won't recover from this. No, Valen agreed. They won't. For the first time in history, the Dralix had been forced into a world they couldn't control. A world with loss, with consequences, with permanence. They had wanted to erase humanity. Instead, humanity had rewritten them. Orvikstan's voice was lower now, edged with finality. What happens next? Valen exhaled. He thought of every war, every lost battle where his people had been seen as weak, primitive, temporary. He thought of what the Dralix had done to civilizations before them, worlds wiped clean, rewritten as if they had never lived, never fought, never mattered. Not this time. He stared at the broken, trembling Dralix entity before him. It had never known suffering before today. Valen's voice was a quiet, steady thing. Now, they remember us. He turned, walking away, and for the first time in history, the Dralix were the ones who had to live with it.